In 1913, Argentina was richer than France, richer than Germany, one of the 10 wealthiest nations on Earth. Today, it's defaulted 9 times, cycled through 5 currencies, and stripped 13 zeros from its money. The economy doesn't just collapse, it collapses the same way every time, and that pattern traces back to a single economic blueprint. In the winter of 1913, Buenos Aires unveiled the Subte, Latin America's first subway, and the 13th in the world. That same year, Argentina's economy ranked among the top 10 globally by income per person, ahead of Germany and France. The city's grand boulevards, electric trams, and opera houses drew comparisons to Paris. Waves of European immigrants arrived by the shipload, drawn by high wages and promises of land. 1 out of every 3 Argentines lived in the capital's orbit, feeding a boom in exports, construction, and cosmopolitan ambition. The numbers are hard to overstate. Madison Project data puts Argentina's per capita GDP at about $6,100 in 1910 international dollars, nearly level with the most advanced economies of the era. The Subte's opening on December 1, 1913, was more than a feat of engineering. It was a symbol of a country that saw itself as a peer of the great powers, yet hidden beneath this surface was a fragile foundation. Argentina's golden age was built on commodity exports and a flood of foreign capital, but its underlying economic reflexes were already forming. The story that follows isn't simply about decline, it's about why a nation that once stood shoulder to shoulder with the richest in the world would find itself trapped in a cycle of crisis, a cycle that repeats, not by accident, but by design. Juan Domingo Perón took office in 1946 with a vision that would leave a lasting imprint on Argentina's economic DNA. His government moved quickly, nationalizing the railways, utilities, and oil fields. State ownership became the backbone of the economy, turning public enterprises into engines of employment and social policy. At the same time, Perón negotiated sweeping wage increases with powerful labor unions. The 1949 law of salary readjustment tied paychecks directly to the cost of living, sparking a new era of wage contracts indexed to inflation. For many workers, real income soared. Factories multiplied, fueled by a deliberate policy of import substitution industrialization. High tariffs and government credit lines protected domestic industry from foreign competition, while consumer goods and machinery were produced at home. Price controls on food and basic goods aimed to keep the cost of living in check, even as public spending surged. This blueprint, state control, wage hikes, import barriers, and persistent deficits created a new economic reflex. The central bank became the silent partner, financing government spending by expanding the money supply. Over time, the link between wages, prices, and public finances hardened into a feedback loop. Higher wages drove up costs, which led to new price controls and more deficit spending. The immediate result was growth and social mobility, but beneath the surface, inflationary pressures began to build. Perón's model institutionalized the habit of spending today and paying for it tomorrow, not just through taxes, but through the steady erosion of the currency. This structural pattern would outlast Perón himself, resurfacing in every major crisis that followed. A nation's confidence in its currency is rarely tested as brutally as in Argentina. Since 1970, 5 different currencies have come and gone, each one a failed promise to reset the system and wipe away the damage of the last. One current peso is worth about 10 trillion of the pesos used in 1969. Every redenomination crossed out zeros, but never the underlying habit of spending beyond the country's means and using the printing press to fill the gap. The pattern became undeniable in June 1975. Economy Minister Celestino Rodrigo, facing a ballooning fiscal deficit and mounting inflation, announced a shock package that would become known as the Rodrigazo. Overnight, the peso was devalued by 100%. Utility bills and public transport fares soared, some by as much as 180%. Wages, still indexed to inflation, chased prices in a dizzying spiral. The government's attempt to contain the crisis only accelerated it. Within months, inflation exploded, savings evaporated, and the middle class watched their purchasing power collapse. The Rodrigazo wasn't an isolated event. It was the first modern instance in which the full mechanics of Argentina's economic reflex, the cycle of spend, print, devalue, repeat, were laid bare for all to see. What followed was not just a temporary shock, but the opening act of a long, grinding spiral toward hyperinflation. By the late 1980s, Argentina's currency was unraveling faster than ever before. In 1989, inflation hit a staggering 3,079% for the year. Prices doubled in a matter of weeks. At its peak, the monthly rate soared to 197%. Shoppers raced to buy groceries before labels changed again by the afternoon. The Plan Austral, introduced just 4 years earlier as a reset, crumbled under the pressure. Banknotes flooded the streets, but their value evaporated by the hour. Savings accounts, pensions, and paychecks were wiped out almost overnight. President Raúl Alfonsín, unable to contain the chaos, left office 6 months early. Into the storm stepped Carlos Menem, with economist Domingo Cavallo soon at his side. Their answer was radical: anchor the peso directly to the US dollar. In 1991, the convertibility law fixed the exchange rate at 1 peso to 1 US dollar, enforced by law and backed by hard currency reserves. The printing presses stopped. For the first time in a generation, Argentines could trust that the price of bread would be the same tomorrow as it was today. Hyperinflation vanished almost immediately. Cavallo's peg delivered stability, but it also set a hard constraint. The government could only spend what it could borrow or earn. Beneath the calm, the old reflexes of deficits, debt, and dependence on foreign capital remained, waiting for the next shock. December 2001. The banks closed their doors. Overnight, the government froze nearly every savings account in the country. People lined the streets, pounding on metal shutters, desperate to withdraw cash that no longer belonged to them. The word Corralito became shorthand for betrayal. Supermarkets ran out of food. ATMs blinked empty. Pensioners and shopkeepers, truck drivers and teachers all found themselves locked out of their own money. The anger spilled into the plazas. Protesters banged pots and pans, demanding answers. Police fired tear gas into the crowds. In just 2 days, 39 people lost their lives in clashes with security forces. As the chaos spread, Argentina's government unraveled. President Fernando de la Rúa resigned and fled the presidential palace by helicopter. In the next 12 days, 4 more men would briefly hold the presidency: Ramón Puerta, Adolfo Rodríguez Sá, Eduardo Camano, and Eduardo Duhalde, each inheriting a crisis that had no solution. The currency peg shattered. The peso collapsed. On December 23rd, the government defaulted on $93 billion in sovereign debt, the largest default the world had ever seen. The International Monetary Fund turned off the taps. Investors fled. The cycle of spend, print, devalue, collapse had snapped back with a vengeance, leaving institutions broken and trust in ruins. For millions, the memory of those days remains a scar that never fully healed. Old habits have proven stubborn. After the chaos of 2001, the Kirchner governments reached for familiar levers: capital controls, multiple exchange rates, and the renationalization of YPF in 2012. The CIPO, strict limits on buying foreign currency, returned in 2011, driving Argentines to seek dollars in informal markets and spawning a maze of parallel rates. Official inflation data from INDEC became so unreliable that in 2013 the IMF issued an unprecedented censure for data manipulation. By the time Mauricio Macri took office in 2015, Argentina had cycled through nearly 24 IMF arrangements. Macri promised openness and reform, but facing a fiscal hole and evaporating reserves, he turned to the fund for a record $57 billion standby loan in 2018. The peso lost half its value within months. The cycle reset once again: new debt, new controls, and another loss of faith. Javier Milei's arrival in late 2023 brought a different style but a familiar dilemma. His shock program slashed the fiscal deficit by about 5% of GDP and unleashed a maxi devaluation. Inflation, which had spiked to 290%, dropped to around 33% within a year, a dramatic swing even by Argentina's standards. Yet the numbers on the balance sheet remain stark. Net international reserves hover at $1.5 billion. On January 9, 2026, a $4.2 billion payment comes due, part of $20 billion in maturities for the year. 22 IMF programs and 9 sovereign defaults have not broken the pattern. The question now hangs in the air: can a radical break with the past finally hold, or is the country simply approaching its 10th sovereign default, driven by the same old reflexes? As Argentina faces its 10th potential default and inflation still exceeds 200%, every new reform is watched by a nation trained to expect the pattern. Structural change remains the unresolved frontier. Until the cycle breaks, each promise of stability carries the weight of history. What do you think comes next?